Jake, the truth isn't yours to interrupt. It belongs to the people you've ignored for far too long. The words hit the studio like a lightning strike, sharp and unrelenting, slicing through the air with the weight of generations behind them. For a split second, silence swallowed the room. The cameras froze on Jake Tapper's face, his confident smirk faltering as the Congresswoman from Texas locked her eyes on him without blinking. The crowd of invited guests shifted in their seats, some gasping, some nodding, as though they had just witnessed a blow land harder than any physical punch. The CNN set glowed under the harsh studio lights, every reflection on the polished desk amplifying the tension. Millions watching at home could almost feel the heat radiating from the stage. This wasn't politics as usual. This was something raw, something dangerous, something unforgettable. Tapper leaned forward, preparing to reclaim control, but his voice caught in his throat. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to being called out so directly, so unapologetically, by someone who refused to play by the quiet rules of deference. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't smile. Her presence alone demanded the moment be taken seriously. She wasn't here to entertain Jake Tapper's questions. She was here to expose what his questions represented: a carefully constructed gatekeeping, a script that kept real voices on the margins while the powerful carried on unchecked. Every syllable she spoke carried the weight of her constituents, her history, her struggle to reach this stage. The studio lights shimmered. Cameras worried to catch every flicker of emotion. Across social media, the clip was already being cut, captioned, and shared before Tapper could even open his mouth again. Viewers watching live leaned forward, some whispering, some shouting at their screens. Something unprecedented had cracked through the facade of television's polished debates, and as Tapper's rehearsed composure began to crumble, the atmosphere thickened with anticipation. Everyone in the room knew they weren't just witnessing a sharp exchange of words. They were witnessing a rupture, the kind of moment that echoes far beyond the walls of a newsroom. But this was only the beginning of a showdown that would rattle the nation. The confrontation didn't erupt in a vacuum. It came at a time when the nation's soul felt like it was dangling over a precipice. With the next election looming, Americans weren't simply choosing between candidates, they were choosing between two competing visions of the country itself. On one side stood the tired machinery of old politics, polished talking heads, and narratives neatly tied together for nightly broadcasts. On the other stood voices like Jasmine Crockett's, raw, unapologetic, unwilling to be silenced. That's why this debate mattered. It wasn't just an exchange of opinions. It was a collision of values. Jake Tapper had long been a master of his arena. With a raised eyebrow and a carefully timed pause, he played the role of arbiter, shaping discussions with an invisible hand. To many, he was the face of establishment media, the gatekeeper who decided what truth the public would see and how much of it they could handle. His reputation thrived on control, on keeping the narrative within the boundaries of civility, even if that civility often disguised inequality. On this night, he wore that same smug armor, certain that his authority was unshakable. But across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, and she was not there to play by his rules. She carried the weight of a different America, one forged in the crucible of struggle and resilience. She wasn't polished to fit a television mold. She was fire, honesty, and grit embodied in a single figure. To her supporters, she represented the people who had been spoken over, written off, or dismissed entirely. If Tapper was the gatekeeper, Crockett was the battering ram. Every election season promises to be the most important of our lifetimes, but this one carried a different urgency. Democracy itself seemed fragile, threatened by forces eager to roll back rights and silence dissent. That's what made the stakes of this debate so high. It wasn't about ratings. It wasn't about whose poll numbers ticked upward the next morning. It was about whether the story of America would continue to be written by the few, or whether it would finally make space for the many. The set gleamed under its artificial lights, but behind the glow lay tension thick enough to choke on. Tapper's tone dripped with condescension, as though daring Crockett to step out of line, and she did with every unflinching word, with every refusal to bow to his framing. For her, this wasn't just a televised debate. It was a test of whether voices like hers could stand their ground against the polished machinery of mainstream narrative. Millions watched, not just for political theater, but for validation. Viewers from immigrant households, working-class families, communities long marginalized, they leaned in, hungry to see someone who spoke their language, who carried their battles into rooms they had never been invited into. Crockett wasn't only answering Tapper. She was answering decades of dismissal. The unspoken message that some voices simply don't belong at the center of power. And yet, even as the tension escalated, few could have predicted just how explosive the night would become. For all of Tapper's certainty and Crockett's resolve, what happened next would spiral far beyond anyone's expectations. This was no longer a debate contained within studio walls. It was the spark to something larger, something unstoppable. What happens next? No one saw coming. Long before the confrontation with Jasmine Crockett, Jake Tapper had built a career on commanding rooms, cutting off guests mid-sentence and framing his questions in ways that seemed less about answers and more about performance. To his admirers, he was sharp, unrelenting, a journalist who could corner a senator or a general with the same icy glare. To his critics, he was something else entirely, a man who thrived on control, on the illusion of balance, while quietly bending the narrative to suit the corridors of power he claimed to scrutinize. Tapper's rise was the stuff of Washington lore. He wasn't just another talking head, he was marketed as the tough-minded truth-teller who wouldn't let anyone off easy. When politicians squirmed, he smirked. When they stumbled, he leaned in with a well-rehearsed look of mock sympathy that said more than his words ever could. Night after night, he polished his reputation as the watchdog of American politics. But beneath the veneer of impartiality lay a pattern too glaring to ignore. His toughest questions always seemed reserved for outsiders, dissenters, and disruptors. While the powerful voices of the establishment were handled with kid gloves, this was Tapper's brand of toughness, selective outrage, dressed up as journalism. When warhawks spun falsehoods, he nodded gravely, letting their words hang unchallenged. But when grassroots leaders or progressive newcomers took the stage, his tone shifted, his smile sharpened, his interruptions multiplied. He became the arbiter not of truth, but of acceptability. His job, whether he admitted it or not, was to keep the gates closed to those who threatened to change the script, and in doing so, he became a symbol. Tapper represented the very arrogance many Americans had come to despise, the polished elite who decided which voices counted, which stories deserved airtime, which truths were too inconvenient for primetime. He wielded that power with a kind of smug detachment, as though it were not only his duty but his birthright. Even his mannerisms carried that sense of entitlement, the raised eyebrow, the rehearsed sigh, the half-smile that seemed to say, "You'll never beat me at my own game." To understand why his unraveling during the debate with Crockett was so satisfying, one has to appreciate the intimidation he projected. For years, Tapper's interviews had been treated as trials by fire. Candidates and activists alike walked into his studio knowing they would be pressed, cornered, perhaps even humiliated. Entire careers had been shaped by his verdicts, by whether he let a clip breathe or cut it off in mid-sentence. To spar with Jake Tapper was to step into an arena where the rules were already stacked against you, and he made sure you knew it. But the contradictions never stopped bleeding through. For every fiery exchange that showcased his courage, there were countless moments when he pulled punches for those who shared his circles of influence. He would hammer an activist for an imperfect slogan, then pivot to a senator peddling half-truths with little more than a raised brow. His balance was theater, his impartiality a mask, and the audience, though often uncritical, could sense the game. The smirk was too polished, the timing too perfect. He wasn't chasing truth, he was performing it by the time Crockett sat across from him. The myth of Tapper as an untouchable force was already beginning to fray. The public had grown weary of the double standards, the way voices of color, women, immigrants, and working-class fighters were interrogated to exhaustion, while establishment figures coasted through interviews unscathed. Tapper might not have admitted it, but he had come to embody the very elitism his viewers claimed to resent. His show was less a space for truth and more a fortress of control, one he had guarded ruthlessly for decades. And that is why his eventual undoing mattered so much. Watching Tapper stumble, seeing the smug armor crack, was more than a personal embarrassment. It was a symbolic collapse of a larger arrogance, the arrogance of mainstream media that had, for too long, told America who was worthy of being heard and who wasn't. He had built his career on intimidating others. But in that studio, across from Jasmine Crockett, the intimidation no longer worked. For once, the gatekeeper found himself blocked out. And as the nation leaned in to witness the fall, the air was thick with anticipation. Tapper had spent years casting himself as the final word. Now, for the first time, the final word would not be his dot. What Crockett unleashed next would not only shake Tapper, but tear through the very illusion of his be. For Jasmine Crockett became a name whispered with admiration across social media feeds and news cycles. She was a daughter of Texas soil, a child who grew up watching a state shaped by both resilience and resistance. Her roots weren't gilded in privilege. They were anchored in working-class grit, in communities where hard work was often met with closed doors, where speaking the truth came with consequences. From an early age, she learned that dignity wasn't given, it had to be demanded. Her journey began not in television studios or marble hallways, but in the crowded classrooms of Dallas, where she absorbed both lessons and injustice. Crockett wasn't the type to sit quietly when something felt wrong. Teachers recognized her sharpness, the way her questions cut deeper than her years, the way she refused to be pacified with half-answers. That restless hunger to understand and to challenge would become her hallmark. When she pursued law, it wasn't because it was glamorous. It was because she had seen too many people in her community silenced by systems designed to grind them down. As a young attorney, Crockett often took cases others wouldn't touch, defending the powerless. Standing with clients who couldn't pay her what her time was worth but who carried stories that demanded to be heard. In cramped courtrooms, she sharpened her arguments, her voice growing stronger with each battle. She lost some cases, won others. But every fight taught her something that would one day reverberate on a much larger stage. Truth has a power that polished rhetoric can never manufacture. Her unapologetic style didn't come without a price. From the moment she stepped into politics, she became a target. Opponents sneered at her tone, labeled her angry when she was simply honest, dismissed her as unprofessional when she refused to bow to tradition. The attacks came from all sides: political rivals who feared her rise, commentators who mocked her cadence, even allies who urged her to soften her edges. But Crockett refused. She had seen too much to compromise. She had heard too many voices drowned out. If her truth-telling made others uncomfortable, then perhaps the discomfort was the point. Through each wave of criticism, she grew tougher. When her identity was ridiculed, she leaned harder into it. When her appearance was dissected, she reminded her critics that her words, not her wardrobe, were the battlefield. She faced death threats, smears, endless attempts to undermine her credibility. Yet each attack only added steel to her spine. Crockett wasn't a politician playing a role. She was a woman carrying the scars of real struggle, and it showed. That authenticity is what set her apart. In a political landscape littered with rehearsed sound bites and poll-tested phrases, Crockett's voice cut through with something unmistakable: sincerity. She didn't hide the cadence of her Texas roots, didn't sand down the sharp edges of her delivery. She carried the rhythm of her people, the urgency of their needs. She embodied the America that worked double shifts, that raised children in the shadow of uncertainty, that had learned to survive when the system seemed designed to forget them. Her supporters saw themselves in her not the polished veneer of a career politician, but the raw honesty of someone who lived the battles she spoke about. Immigrant families, single parents, young activists, workers fighting for fair pay. They rallied behind her because she didn't just represent them, she was one of them. She wasn't speaking from the outside looking in. She was speaking from within the very struggle so many recognized. That's what made her rise both inspiring and dangerous. Inspiring to those who hungered for leaders who refused to be scripted. Dangerous to those who depended on gatekeeping to maintain their grip on power. Crockett represented a crack in the facade, a reminder that real voices could no longer be pushed to the margins. As her platform grew, so did the pressure. Television appearances became battlegrounds where she was expected to be tamed, to fit neatly into boxes that never suited her. But time and again, she refused. Every interruption she endured, every dismissive glance she faced, only reminded her of why she had stepped into politics in the first place. She wasn't here to play along. She was here to confront, to reveal, to demand. That it was that unyielding spirit that brought her to the stage across from Jake Tapper. She hadn't clawed her way through years of courtroom fights, political ambushes, and personal attacks just to shrink before a smug anchor's interruptions. She carried the weight of those battles with her, each scar a badge of survival. In that studio, beneath the glare of the cameras, Jasmine Crockett was not merely a congresswoman facing an interview. She was the voice of millions who had been silenced, the embodiment of America's unpolished truth, standing against the polished arrogance of a media elite. Every word she prepared to speak carried not just her conviction, but the stories of all those who had never been given a seat at the table, and it was all leading up to this night, her moment against Tapper. The first exchange was supposed to be routine. Tapper leaned into his notes, his voice steady, his posture commanding, the tone of a man who had done this dance 1,000 times. He framed the question carefully, lacing it with doubt about Crockett's record, questioning whether her fiery rhetoric translated into real results. It was the sort of opening that usually put his guests on the defensive, forcing them to justify, explain, and shrink into his narrative. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't shrinking. She let him finish barely. As he tried to pile on interruptions, she raised her hand slightly, not to silence him, but to reclaim her ground. Her voice was calm, controlled, but edged with steel. "Jake, I know you're used to cutting people off before they finish," she said, her gaze steady, "but you don't get to rewrite my record while I'm sitting here." The line drew an audible stir from the audience. A few muffled laughs, a few gasps, the kind of response that suggested something electric had just shifted. Tapper forced a smile, that practiced grin he used when he felt the need to reassert dominance. He leaned closer to the desk, sharpening his tone, firing off another question before she had fully finished her answer. He thought he could pin her down, force her into yes or no soundbites, but Crockett wasn't playing his game. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't mirror his interruptions. Instead, she spoke with a measured cadence, the rhythm of someone who had spent years in courtrooms where clarity could decide a person's fate. "The people I represent," she continued, "don't have the luxury of polished spin. They don't get to interrupt injustice halfway through and say, 'Wait, can you explain it in a soundbite?' They live the whole story, every day. And I'm here to tell it whether you give me the time or not." Tapper's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, and the cameras, always hungry for drama, zoomed in just enough to catch it. The control he was so used to was slipping. He tried to pivot, raising the stakes of his question, bringing up past controversies, hoping to rattle her. But Crockett absorbed every word and answered with the same steady fire. She wasn't flustered, she was focused. Each time he tried to box her in, she widened the frame, reminding viewers that this wasn't about semantics. It was about values. The audience inside the studio began to murmur, their reactions harder to contain. Some leaned forward, whispering, others shook their heads at Tapper's persistence. At home, millions of viewers sensed it to the tension, the imbalance, the rare side of the anchor not fully in control of his own stage. And still, Crockett pressed on. Jake, you can keep asking me the same question a dozen ways. My answer doesn't change, because the truth doesn't bend just because it makes you uncomfortable. Her words hung in the air like a challenge, daring him to push harder. He did. He raised his voice, talked over her again, a touch of frustration bleeding through. But this time, his interruptions didn't cut her down, they only amplified her composure. She waited, then delivered her rebuttals with precision, her every pause amplifying the silence before her words landed. She wasn't just defending herself, she was exposing the very dynamic millions of viewers had felt, but rarely seen, called out in real time. The gatekeeper trying to control the story. And the truth, refusing to be silenced. The cameras panned between them, the close-up on Tapper's clenched jaw, the steady confidence in Crockett's eyes. The clash was no longer about policy points. It had become a test of character, a battle between arrogance and authenticity. But now, the energy in the room was undeniable. Even those who had come expecting Tapper to dominate sensed the shift. Something new was happening, something unscripted, something dangerous for the man who prided himself on control. The nation leaned closer, waiting for the spark. The room seemed to tremble with anticipation, as if the very air inside the CNN studio understood what was about to unfold. Jake Tapper leaned forward once more, his voice raised, his question sharp but increasingly desperate. Each interruption designed to claw back control of the stage. He tried to trap Jasmine Crockett in a tangle of contradictions, framing her as reckless, untested, unfit for the weight of national leadership. It was the classic Tapper technique: corner the guest, box them in, then deliver the knockout blow himself. But this time, his blow never landed. Crockett's eyes narrowed, her posture unshaken, her tone calm. She let him finish his barrage of words, then paused. It was not the pause of hesitation but of strategy, of someone about to deliver a line so sharp it needed the silence to frame it. The audience held its breath. Even the cameras seemed to tighten their focus, catching the tension in her jaw, the certainty in her gaze. Jake, she began softly, her voice steady as steel. You've built a career out of talking over people who scare you. The line landed like a thunderclap. A wave of murmurs rippled through the audience. Tapper blinked rapidly, his smirk tightening into something closer to a grimace. Crockett didn't rush. She let the silence work for her, then layered fact upon fact, each one sharper than the last. You've let generals sell wars on this network without asking a single hard question. You've let CEOs dodge responsibility while workers lose their jobs and homes. But the second a black woman from Texas dares to raise her voice, suddenly you've got all the tough questions in the world. The gasps were audible this time. A few claps rang out before quickly being hushed by producers waving their hands. Tapper's jaw clenched, but he tried to interject, muttering about professionalism and balance. Crockett raised her hand slightly, not to silence him, but to remind him, and everyone watching, that she was not about to be bulldozed. You call this balance? She pressed, her words quickening, her passion rising with every sentence. Balance is not giving lies and truth the same airtime. Balance is not protecting the powerful while interrogating the powerless. That's not balance, Jake. That's bias, the kind this country is sick of. Tapper's face flushed, his composure slipping further. His usual trick of redirecting the narrative was crumbling under Crockett's relentless clarity. She wasn't just answering his questions, she was exposing his methods, peeling back the curtain on the game he had played for decades. Then came the moral strike. She lowered her voice, the cadence shifting from fiery to intimate, almost confessional. Do you know what it's like, she asked, to grow up watching your neighbors work 3 jobs and still not have health care? To see children in your district show up to school hungry, while people on shows like this argue about whether their parents even deserve a seat at the table? Do you know what it's like to be told, over and over, that your story doesn't matter until you fight your way onto this stage, only to be interrupted by the same arrogance that tried to silence you in the first place? The studio was silent. Now, even Tapper's lips pressed shut. His rebuttal caught somewhere between his throat and his pride. Crockett's words carried more than personal conviction. They carried the echoes of millions who had lived that reality. And then, she delivered. The emotional appeal, the final layer. Her voice grew stronger, every word measured, every pause deliberate. I'm not here tonight because it's easy. I'm here because someone has to look you in the eye and say enough. Enough pretending that the struggles of ordinary Americans are side notes to your script. Enough pretending that gatekeeping is journalism. Enough pretending that my voice, or anyone else's who comes from the margins, doesn't belong here. We belong, and we're not asking for permission anymore. The eruption was immediate. The audience gasped, then clapped, then cheered. The producer's frantic hand-waving, no longer enough to contain the reaction. Tapper sat frozen, his pen resting uselessly on his notes, his face betraying the shock of a man unaccustomed to losing control on his own stage. And then came the mic line, the one that would replay across every platform, the one that would define the debate. Crockett leaned in, her eyes locked on his, her voice lower now, sharper, like a blade cutting through glass. You can interrupt me all you want, Jake, but you can't interrupt the truth, and the truth is bigger than you. The room exploded. Applause, shouts, whistles, the kind of raw, uncontrolled response that rarely survived the editing room but could not be contained in this moment. The sound was deafening, a collective release of years of frustration, validation, and hope. Crockett leaned back slightly, not with arrogance but with the calm certainty of someone who had said what needed to be said. Tapper, for once, was speechless. His eyes darted toward the cameras, then back at his notes, then toward Crockett again, as if searching for a lifeline that wasn't there. His trademark smirk had vanished, replaced by the uneasy stillness of a man who had just been stripped of his armor in front of millions. In that instant, the roles reversed. The gatekeeper became the questioned, the authority became the exposed, and the underdog became the undeniable force. Jasmine Crockett had not just answered his questions. She had dismantled his credibility. She had turned his interruptions into evidence of his bias, his smugness into proof of his fragility, and as the applause slowly subsided, the cameras captured the moment in sharp focus. A congresswoman sitting tall, steady, unbroken, her presence radiating strength, while across from her sat a veteran anchor, rattled, diminished, caught in the very trap he had set for so many others. The mic drop had landed. The turning point was undeniable. The villain had crumbled, and the hero had ascended. But even as the cheers echoed and the clip began its journey to viral immortality, the night was far from over. What came next would send shockwaves beyond the studio walls, igniting conversations, sparking movements, and forcing a country to confront what it had just witnessed. And no one, not even Jake Tapper himself, was prepared for the aftermath. The debate wasn't even over before the first clips hit the internet. Some audience members had been streaming snippets live. But the moment Jasmine Crockett delivered her mic drop line, "You can interrupt me all you want, Jake, but you can't interrupt the truth. And the truth is bigger than you," the floodgates burst wide open. Within minutes, hashtags began trending across platforms. Hashtag Crockett Unleashed. Hashtag TruthByGerDanTapper. Hashtag Mic Drop Moment. TikTok edits appeared almost instantly, pairing Crockett's line with dramatic sound effects, slow-motion replays, even clips of fireworks exploding in the sky. Twitter lit up with side-by-side images, Tapper's stunned silence against Crockett's unshakable gaze. The contrast was too perfect, too cinematic to resist. By the time the debate officially wrapped, the clip had already racked up millions of views. Late-night hosts, always hungry for viral gold, jumped in before their shows even aired. One tweeted, "Forget the debates, Crockett just gave us the State of the Union." Another quipped, "Jake Tapper asked for receipts, and Jasmine brought the whole filing cabinet." Social media users framed Crockett as more than just a sharp debater. They cast her as a modern folk hero, the fearless voice who stood up to a powerful media gatekeeper and didn't blink. Fan art began circulating, illustrations of her with a microphone like a sword, comic-style panels depicting her as a warrior, facing down the smug anchor. Activists, especially those from immigrant, working-class, and marginalized communities, shared the clip with captions like, "This is what it looks like when someone speaks for us." Meanwhile, Tapper's reputation took an immediate hit. Memes mocked his stunned expression, his attempt at a smirk that collapsed into visible panic. Screenshots circulated under captions like, "When you realize you're not the smartest person in the room," and "Big interruption energy." Zero results. On Reddit, entire threads dissected his unraveling, with users gleefully analyzing each frame like sports commentators. Breaking down a losing play, politicians weighed in next. Progressives praised Crockett's courage, calling her performance a turning point for truth in media. Even some centrists, typically cautious in their praise, admitted she had shown a rare authenticity that broke through the noise. On the other side of the aisle, conservative figures rushed to defend Tapper, but their posts often backfired, amplifying the clip further. Every defense became fuel for the fire. Every complaint, another reminder of the line that had cut so deep. Celebrities joined the chorus. A chart-topping musician tweeted, "Somebody get Jasmine Crockett a mic made of gold." A Hollywood actor posted a video reenacting the exchange with exaggerated dramatics, garnering millions more views. Influencers stitched the clip into their own content, from comedy skits to motivational reels, framing Crockett as the embodiment of unshakable confidence. The ripple effects didn't stop online. Activist groups used the moment as a rallying cry, blasting it out in newsletters, weaving Crockett's words into speeches, and projecting her quote onto buildings in major cities. At marches, protesters held signs with her line, "The truth is bigger than you." What had started as a single rebuttal in a studio was morphing into a slogan, a movement, a cultural shorthand for pushing back against entrenched power. Even media analysts, usually quick to downplay viral drama, couldn't ignore the impact. Headlines appeared in real time. Crockett shakes CNN stage. Tapper stumbles in clash of values. When the gatekeeper got locked out. Editorials framed the night as a rare moment when authenticity cut through the media machine. When the underdog seized the narrative and refused to let go. And through it all, Tapper remained conspicuously silent. While his colleagues at CNN tried to spin the exchange as spirited debate, the silence from Tapper's own social media accounts only deepened the sense that he had been rattled. Rumors swirled of behind-the-scenes tension, producers arguing about how to package the debate for replay without further humiliating their anchor, but the internet had already decided no amount of editing could erase what millions had witnessed live. By dawn the next morning, the moment wasn't just trending, it was everywhere. Morning shows played the clip on loop, panelists debating whether Crockett had crossed a line or spoken a necessary truth. Radio hosts replayed the audio, their callers gushing with excitement. Even high school students mimicked the line in classrooms, while college debate teams dissected it as a textbook example of rhetorical dominance. Jasmine Crockett had gone from underdog to icon almost overnight. Her supporters framed her not just as a politician, but as a symbol of courage, of authenticity, of the refusal to bow before institutional arrogance. The clip wasn't merely viral. It was a cultural phenomenon, the kind that seeped into every conversation, every meme cycle, every whispered joke in corporate offices and living rooms alike. And yet, for all the praise, all the memes, all the celebrity endorsements and political reactions, there was a sense that the story was still unfolding. Something bigger was stirring, something that couldn't be contained by hashtags and reaction videos alone, because while Crockett's mic drop had electrified the nation, it had also set forces in motion behind the scenes, forces determined to strike back, to reclaim control, to remind her, and everyone who stood with her, that the old gatekeepers weren't going to surrender quietly. The clip was the spark. The firestorm was still to come, and the biggest shock was yet to come. When the noise began to settle, when the memes had run their first fevered cycle, and the pundits finished shouting over one another, Jasmine Crockett stepped back into the spotlight not to gloat, not to revel in her viral moment, but to reframe it entirely. She made it clear from the start, this wasn't about her versus Jake Tapper. It wasn't even about a single debate. It was about something far deeper, something older, something every American could feel stirring beneath the surface. This isn't my victory, she told a crowd gathered at a town hall days later. Her voice carried not as the sharp blade of debate, but as the steady warmth of conviction. What you saw wasn't me winning against an anchor. What you saw was the truth refusing to be silenced. What you saw was dignity, standing tall when arrogance tried to interrupt. What you saw was the same struggle everyday people fight at work, at school, in their communities, to be heard, to be respected, to be treated as equals. The words landed with weight because they came from a place people recognized. Crockett didn't stand above her supporters, she stood with them, weaving her own confrontation into a universal lesson. She spoke of democracy not as a slogan, but as a living, breathing promise that required courage to protect. And courage, she reminded them, was not the absence of fear, it was the decision to stand tall, even when the deck was stacked against you. Tapper's arrogance, she explained, was not unique. It was the face of a system that too often dismissed voices it didn't want to hear, that cut off stories it found inconvenient, that tried to compress the complexity of human struggle into sound bites. But voices matter, she declared, and integrity wins. Every time. It wasn't just political theater anymore, it was a call to remember what democracy is supposed to mean. Her clash on CNN became an allegory for the larger fight, the everyday battles for recognition, the ongoing push for justice, the insistence that truth cannot be buried under polished interruptions or elitist sneers. As she spoke, people in the crowd nodded, some with tears in their eyes. For them, the debate had been more than entertainment. It had been proof that someone could stand on the biggest stage, stare arrogance in the face, and refuse to bow. That image gave them permission to believe their own voices could matter too. Crockett ended not with triumph but with humility. I didn't go to that debate to become a viral clip, she said softly. I went there to do what my community sent me to do. Speak the truth, no matter the cost. If that truth shook the nation, then maybe it needed to be shaken. Maybe it's time we all start shaking things up. The message was unmistakable. The moment wasn't about her microphone, his smirk, or even the millions of views online. It was about democracy itself, about the power of dignity over arrogance, courage over cowardice, truth over spin. As the applause swelled, Crockett's words echoed beyond that room. carried through social feeds, replayed in classrooms and community centers, whispered at kitchen tables. The takeaway lingered like a charge in the air. This fight isn't finished, and it belongs to everyone. Because in the end, the moral wasn't that Jasmine Crockett had bested Jake Tapper. The moral was that integrity can still pierce through arrogance, that voices long interrupted can still rise above the noise, and that when dignity refuses to back down, democracy breathes a little stronger. And somewhere in that truth, America caught a glimpse of itself, not as it was, not as Tapper wanted to frame it, but as it could be, bold, unafraid, and unbroken. The debate that shook America wasn't just about Jake Tapper or Jasmine Crockett. It was about all of us, about what happens when truth collides with arrogance, when courage refuses to be silenced, and when dignity takes the microphone back from those who think they own the stage. For one unforgettable night, millions of people saw a reflection of their own struggles and their own resilience. Crockett's stand wasn't a solo act. It was a reminder that democracy only works when ordinary people speak up, push back, and refuse to be interrupted by systems that try to write them out of the story. That spark you felt watching her face down one of the most powerful anchors in America. That's the same spark that has carried every fight for justice forward, from civil rights to voting rights to the everyday battles in workplaces, classrooms, and neighborhoods. And here's the truth. That spark belongs to you too. It lives in your story, your courage, your refusal to back down when the odds are stacked high. Crockett showed us that the fight for dignity isn't fought in silence. It's fought out loud, and it's fought together. So if this story moved you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that cut through the noise and remind us what's really at stake. Drop a comment below with the truth you refuse to let be silenced. Your voice matters here. And share this video with someone who needs to hear it, because movements don't grow in the dark. They grow when we spread the light. The debate shook America. Now it's our turn to carry that energy forward together.